Nolan Vance had come only to hand over a folder and leave the hotel before the gala began. But when the glass shattered, when the corridor lights went dark, and when two men moved fast toward Chief Executive Claire Halston, he did not run. He pulled her down behind the reception counter, covered her body with his own, and guided her out through the service passage. When the security team finally reached them, the head of security, Grant Holloway, watched the way Nolan held the door, checked the blind angles, and signaled with his hand. Grant went pale. He knew this man. And if Nolan Vance was here, the attack was no accident. The Crown Harbor Hotel in Chicago glittered that evening as if wealth itself had been poured into its walls, and Halston Advanced Systems filled every room of it with the kind of people who owned the future. Hundreds of guests from finance and technology moved beneath the chandeliers, their tuxedos pressed and their smiles rehearsed, and outside a line of expensive cars stretched along the curb while photographers waited for anyone worth a photograph. Nolan Vance was not one of those people. He was there to finish a report on the hotel's backup power system and its emergency exits, an inspection like 100 others he had done that year, and he walked through the marble lobby carrying a worn tool case, wearing an old jacket and a cheap watch, entirely invisible to a world that measured men by the cut of their suits. He waited near the back of the lobby for the manager to sign his paperwork, content to be overlooked, and it was in that quiet waiting that he first saw Claire Halston. She stood near a column with a man Nolan did not yet know, and though her voice never rose, something in her posture told him this was not a friendly conversation. The man was older, silver at the temples, dressed with the effortless calm of someone who had never once worried about money. His name was Lucian Ashcroft, and he was pressing her, gently, relentlessly, to accept an offer to buy her company. Claire refused. She refused the way a person refuses when she has refused many times already, and Lucian only smiled and said, in a voice as smooth as the marble around them, that tomorrow she might not have the right to refuse at all. No one nearby treated it as a threat, because Lucian Ashcroft never sounded like a threat, and Nolan did not step in either, for it was not his place and not his business. But an old instinct in him, one he had spent years trying to quiet, began to notice things the celebrating crowd could not. A camera at the end of the hall lost its small red light, dark where it should have glowed. A service door that ought to have been locked stood barely ajar, held open by nothing he could see. A waiter crossed the room wearing shoes that did not match his uniform, the shoes of a man who expected to move quickly, and near the exit one guest watched not the stage where a speaker was warming up the room, but the doors, the corners, the paths out. Nolan felt the arithmetic of it assemble in his mind the way it once had in far more dangerous places, and he decided, reluctantly, that he would find a member of security and mention what he had seen, nothing more, a quiet word from one careful man to another. He never got the chance. The lights stuttered once and then died, plunging the great room into a darkness broken only by the pale glow of emergency fixtures, and in that same instant a sheet of glass somewhere shattered with a sound like a gunshot. The crowd, which a moment before had been laughing, became a single panicked animal, surging toward every exit at once, voices climbing into screams. And in the middle of that chaos Nolan saw the two men, and he understood at once that they were not running away with everyone else. They were running toward Claire Halston. He saw one of them reach, not for a weapon, not for her throat, but for the small bag she carried against her side, and something about the precision of that reach told Nolan everything he needed to know. This was not random violence. This was a man who had come for a specific thing. Nolan set his tool case down on the marble floor, quietly the way a man sets down anything he no longer needs, and he moved. He reached her before her own bodyguards could turn, before they could even locate her in the dark, because Nolan had spent his life learning to move toward danger, while others were still deciding it was real. He did not throw a punch. He did not announce himself. The first thing he did was the only thing that mattered, which was to take Claire Halston out of the line the attackers were traveling. And he did it by wrapping one arm around her and pulling her down and back behind the long stone reception counter, putting his own body squarely between her and the direction the men were coming from. She fought him at first, of course she did, because to her he was only a stranger's hands in the dark, and she twisted against his grip with all the sharp strength of a woman who had never once been helpless. "Don't look at them," he said, close to her ear, and his voice was so calm, so entirely without fear that it cut straight through her panic. "Look at me. Move when I tell you to move." She stopped fighting. Something in that steadiness reached the part of her that made decisions, and she understood, without knowing why, that this man knew exactly what he was doing. Nolan risked a glance over the counter and read the room in a heartbeat. The two men were not firing wildly, were not lunging at other guests, were not doing any of the things that terrorists or robbers might do. They were cutting through the crowd with purpose, adjusting their path each time they lost sight of Claire, hunting one person and one person only. He had inspected this building only hours ago, had walked its every corridor with a clipboard, and so the map of it lived fresh and complete in his mind. He knew where the service hallway ran behind the ballroom, knew which fire doors would close and hold, knew where the emergency lighting would guide them and where it would not. He guided Claire low along the back of the counter, then through a staff door she had never noticed, and into the plain concrete world behind the hotel's glamour. He used the building itself as his weapon. He pulled a fire door shut behind them and threw its mechanical bolt. He chose the turns that put walls between them and the men. He read the corridor the way a sailor reads water, and every choice he made bought distance without a single blow being thrown. It was there, in that bare service corridor, that Grant Holloway and the security team finally caught up with them, weapons drawn, adrenaline high, and Grant's first command was exactly what training demanded. Stepple, away from her now. Nolan did not argue and did not flinch. Instead, he raised one hand and made a small, precise gesture, a tactical signal that meant hold, friendly, clear, a shape of the fingers that no ordinary maintenance worker would ever know. Grant froze. His eyes moved from that hand to the rest of the man, taking in the way Nolan stood with his weight balanced and ready, the way he had positioned himself so that his body still covered Claire from the door, the way his gaze kept flicking to the corner where a threat would most likely appear. Grant had seen a man stand exactly like that once before, years ago in a place he tried very hard not to remember. "Vance," he said, and the word came out cracked. Nolan said nothing. Grant took a single step closer, searching the weathered face in the emergency light. "Nolan Vance?" Claire looked between the two men, the CEO in a torn evening gown and the security veteran and the stranger who had just saved her life, and understood that some history was passing between them that she was not part of. Nolan finally answered, and his voice was quiet and almost tired. "Been a long time, Grant." Then Grant turned to Claire and he said the thing that stopped her breath entirely. "Ma'am, the man who just saved you used to do this exact work in places far more dangerous than any of us will ever see." The police sealed the hotel within the hour, and while officers took statements from shaken guests in the ruined ballroom, Claire, Grant, and Nolan were moved into a small windowless security office to wait. Claire had spent the first minutes after the attack simply breathing, letting the shaking in her hands run its course. But she was a woman who ran a company measured in billions of dollars, and control returned to her quickly. She looked at the two men and said she wanted the truth, all of it, and she wanted it now. Grant glanced at Nolan, who gave no sign one way or the other, and then he told her, choosing his words with the care of a man who knew which of them he was still not permitted to speak aloud. Years ago, Grant said, he had been part of a joint operation overseas, protecting a group of American specialists on foreign soil. The plan had gone wrong in every way a plan can go wrong. Their communications failed. Their exit route was cut off. The people they were guarding were suddenly trapped in a place that was collapsing around them, and the team that was supposed to hold the line found itself outnumbered and out of options. The man sent in to bring them out, the one who arrived when Grant had privately begun to accept that none of them were coming home, was the Navy SEAL now standing in a hotel security office wearing a cheap watch. Grant said only that much of the mission, but it was enough for Claire to understand that Nolan Vance was not an ordinary veteran. Nolan cut in before Grant could go further, plainly uncomfortable, and said that Grant was making it sound like a legend, and it hadn't been a legend. It had been a job that a lot of good people didn't come back from. He did not like the past being polished into a story. He had trained once to pull hostages out of impossible rooms, to keep important people alive when everyone wanted them dead, to build an escape where none existed, to make order out of exactly the kind of chaos the ballroom had become. But he spoke of none of it with pride. Claire watched him and asked the question that did not fit the man Grant was describing. "Then why," she said, "would a man like you be checking emergency exits in a hotel?" Nolan looked at her, and for the first time something in his face softened. "Because it's the kind of job," he said, "that lets me be home on time." That was how Claire learned he was a single father. His wife had died a few years earlier, he told her, when she pressed him gently, and it had changed the whole shape of what he owed the world. He had a daughter, 13 years old now, named June, and he had understood, standing at the edge of his old life, that if he kept living the way he had lived, June could lose a father as well as a mother. So he had left the military, not because he had failed at it, but because he had chosen something that mattered more. He had traded a life of consequence for a life of ordinary evenings, and he had never once regretted it. Grant, who had spent the whole conversation looking at Nolan the way a man looks at someone he thought he'd never see again, said quietly that Nolan had saved his life. Nolan told him to stop. Grant asked Nolan to join Claire's protective detail, at least temporarily, at least until the people behind the attack were found. Nolan refused. He had made a promise to himself and to June that he would not step back through that door, and he meant to keep it. But before he stood to leave, he turned to Claire and asked one more question, the one that had been circling in his mind since the ballroom. "What was in the bag they tried to take?" Claire told him, a phone, a wallet, and a small security device. Nolan looked at Grant, and Grant saw that Nolan had already understood something he himself had missed. The men in the ballroom had never tried to kill Claire. They had tried to reach her, to take her, or to take what she carried. And Claire, watching the two of them, said the last thing any of them expected. The device, she told them, could open a vault of documents that pointed directly at Lucian Ashcroft. Claire explained, in the flat, precise language of someone who understood exactly what she was holding, that her company had been quietly conducting an internal audit for months. In the course of examining the acquisition that Ashcroft kept pushing, her people had found a pattern of payments that made no ordinary sense. Money moving in strange amounts through channels that led not to real businesses but to shell companies. Hollow names registered in convenient places with no employees and no purpose except to carry money and hide where it had come from. If those documents were ever laid before her board of directors, the entire acquisition Ashcroft was building would collapse. And worse than that, for some people, several members of the board might themselves become the subject of an investigation. The device in her bag, she said, did not by itself open the vault. It was one part of a larger system of authentication, a single key that meant nothing on its own but everything when combined with what only she knew. That was why the men in the ballroom had wanted both the device and the woman who carried it. That was why they had reached for the bag and reached for her, why they had tried to take her alive rather than harm her. It explained everything, and as Claire said it aloud, Nolan watched the understanding settle over her face like a shadow, the moment when a person realizes that the danger they survived was only the beginning of the danger they are in. Because this was the thing that Nolan wanted her to see, and he said it plainly. This was not a street attack, not a robbery gone wrong. Not bad luck. Someone had known the schedule of the gala down to the hour. Someone had known precisely where on her person Claire carried the device. Someone had known which camera to darken and exactly when to darken it. That someone was not outside the walls, that someone was inside her own house. There was an informant, close enough to the center of things to hand her enemies the blueprint of her evening, and until she knew who it was, every plan she made would be a plan her enemy could read. Nolan still meant to leave. He said so again, and he meant it. But before he did, he asked Grant to pull up the floor plan of the service level, the same corridors he had inspected that afternoon. And the two men bent over the diagram together the way they must once have bent over other maps in other rooms. And Nolan found the detail that mattered. The attackers had entered and moved through a service door that was not on any guest's path, a door whose existence and access were known only to hotel staff, to the security team itself, or to whoever on the client side had been given control of the event's systems. Someone with a very specific kind of authority had opened the way. Claire went still. The person responsible for the entire logistics of the gala, every door, every credential, every schedule, was her chief operating officer, Blaine Carrington, a man she had trusted for years, a man from an old investment family who had stood beside her through a dozen hard decisions. She did not want to say his name. She did not want to believe it, and she told Nolan she would not accuse anyone on the strength of a floor plan alone. Nolan respected that. He told her she was right to wait, that she should confront no one, tip her hand to no one, until she knew for certain who was feeding information to the other side. Claire asked him why, if he was so determined to walk away, he was still helping her at all. He answered simply, because next time they'll know what they did wrong this time. There was a silence. Grant knew he was right. The first attack had been a test, and the next one would be built from everything the first one had taught them. And as if the building itself wished to confirm it, Grant's tablet chimed with a system report. An access card had been used to open the attacker's door, and the name printed beside the log entry was Nolan Vance. The information that Nolan's card had opened the attacker's door did not stay inside the security office for long. By the next morning it had found its way into the wider world, and it did so in a manner that felt anything but accidental. Lucian Ashcroft, for his part, was far too careful to accuse anyone of anything. He simply appeared, gracious and untroubled, and raised questions, the way a man drops a stone into still water and then admires the ripples. Why, he wondered aloud, had an unknown former Navy SEAL happened to be standing in exactly the place where the CEO was attacked? Why had that man's own access card opened the very door the attackers used? He asked, and he let others answer, and the answers curdled the story. Within a day, the narrative had turned itself completely inside out. Nolan Vance, the man who had shielded Claire Halston with his own body, was now a man who might have staged the entire thing, a hired shadow with military skills and a convenient cover story, the perfect architect for an attack that only pretended to fail. Grant, whatever he believed, had no choice but to suspend Nolan's access to the company and the investigation while the card was examined. But the thing that wounded Nolan most was not the accusation and not the suspicion. It was that Claire said nothing. She did not accuse him, but she could not publicly defend him either, not without proof. not with her own board circling and a billion-dollar company shaking beneath her, and her silence sat between them like a closed door. Nolan went home. There is a scene worth lingering on there, small and quiet, that shows what he truly feared. It was not the loss of his reputation which he had never much valued. It was the sight of his daughter doing homework at the kitchen table, and the thought that his old life, the one he had bled to leave behind, might follow him through his own front door and put her in its path. June looked up at him with the sharp perception children keep for their parents, and asked if he was in trouble again. Nolan set down his coffee and told her no. He said he only had a problem that needed solving, which was a different thing entirely, and she accepted it because she trusted him, and that trust was the whole reason he had walked away from everything. But a man does not stop being careful simply because he has stopped being a soldier, and so that night Nolan went back through his own paperwork, the dull records of an inspector's day, and he found the crack in the story. His access card, the records showed, had been returned to the hotel manager at 7:12 in the evening. Yet the system logged that same card being used to open the service door at 7:14. 2 minutes. In 2 minutes he could not possibly have crossed the hotel to that door, could not have been in two places at once. The card had not been used by him. The card had been copied, and that was the thread that unraveled the rest, because a credential like that could not simply be copied by anyone. The system permitted the duplication of an access credential only through an administrator account, a level of authority granted to very few. Nolan brought it to Grant, and Grant checked, and what he found tightened the knot around a single office. The administrator account that had cloned Nolan's card belonged to the event systems provisioned to the office of the Chief Operating Officer, to Blaine Carrington. It was still only a technical trail, Grant cautioned, still only evidence of a machine and not yet proof that the man himself had knowingly turned traitor, but the trail led exactly where the floor plan had pointed. It was that night that Claire came to see Nolan, and she came not as the chief executive of Halston Advanced Systems but simply as herself, without the armor of her title. She stood in the doorway of the modest house with the tool case in the hall and the child's drawings on the refrigerator, and she apologized for having doubted him. Nolan looked at her for a long moment and then said something that changed the way she saw him entirely. "You don't need to trust me," he told her. "You need to trust the evidence." It was not the answer of a man who wanted to be believed on faith. It was the answer of a man who wanted the truth to stand on its own, and it was precisely that refusal to ask for her trust that finally earned it. Then her phone lit the dark hallway with a message from her board. Lucian Ashcroft had demanded an emergency meeting the following morning, a vote to suspend her authority as chief executive, on the grounds of a security crisis she had failed to prevent. Grant's instinct was to move Claire to a secure location and hold her there until the danger passed, the standard response of every protective professional, and ordinarily he would have been right. But Nolan saw the flaw at once, and he named it. If the informant was still inside the system, then no location was secure, because the moment the route was planned, the informant would know it. Moving her would not hide her. It would simply tell the enemy where to look, and so Nolan proposed something that was not about safety at all. They should stop trying to find the safest place, he said, and instead find out who knew where Claire was going. They should turn the leak itself into a trap. The plan was clean and required no violence. 3 different routes were prepared for Claire's supposed transfer, each given to a different small group within the organization, each of them plausible and complete. No one but Grant knew which route was real, and in fact none of them was, because that was not the point. The point was the leak. Less than an hour after the routes were distributed, a suspicious vehicle appeared, loitering near a stretch of road, and the road it watched was the one route that had been sent to exactly one place, the office of Blaine Carrington. There was no confrontation, no drama. The security team simply changed nothing and quietly alerted the police, and the watchers, having seen nothing, drifted away. But the test had done its work. The source of the leak was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. Grant kept pulling threads while the trap confirmed itself, and he turned his attention to the money behind the private security contractor whose men had likely staffed the attack. One payment led to a company controlled by a man named Tristan Wycliffe, the head of a private security firm, and Wycliffe in turn had received millions in consulting fees from Ashcroft Capital Partners. The chain assembled itself link by link in front of them, a clean line running from the billionaire at the top down through his money to the men in the ballroom, with the information to guide them supplied from within Claire's own company. Ashcroft to Wycliffe to the attackers, and Carrington feeding them the keys. In a rare quiet hour while Grant worked and the city moved on outside, Claire and Nolan found themselves alone, and she asked him the question she had been carrying. Did he miss it, the old life? Nolan considered it honestly, because he did not lie to make himself look better. He admitted that there were moments he missed the terrible clarity of it, the way that life had always told him exactly what he was supposed to do. with no ambiguity and no second thing, only the mission and the next right action. But then he told her the rest. "I used to think the most important mission was always on the other side of the world," he said. "It took me a long time to learn there were missions waiting for me at home." It was in that moment that Claire finally understood him, and understood that she had misread him from the start. She had assumed, the way everyone assumed, that a man inspecting emergency doors in a hotel was a man who had run out of larger things to do, a life that had shrunk by failure. But that was not it at all. Nolan Vance had not settled for an ordinary life. He had deliberately chosen one, had looked at everything the world offered a man with his gifts, and had decided that being home for a 13-year-old was the greater thing. There was nothing small about him. There never had been. He had simply pointed his considerable strength at the one thing most men in his position would have overlooked. But the hour of quiet ended with a problem, and it was Grant who named it. They now had more than enough to prove that Blaine Carrington had betrayed the company. The cloned card, the administrator account, the leaked route, all pointing squarely at him. What they did not have was a single piece of evidence connecting Lucian Ashcroft directly to the attack. If Claire moved too soon, if she accused the billionaire before the chain was closed, Lucian would simply sacrifice Blaine and Wycliffe, express his shock and his sympathy, and wash his hands of the whole affair with the ease of a man who had done it before. Nolan looked at the map of it and said, "Then don't make him confess." Claire asked what he meant to do instead. Nolan's eyes moved to the schedule of the board meeting the next morning. Let him prove that he knows too much. The board of directors convened the next morning in a long glass room high above the city, and Lucian Ashcroft arrived wearing his composure like a well-cut coat. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply laid out one soft sentence at a time, a portrait of a company in crisis and a chief executive no longer equal to it. The CEO had been attacked in public. The company's most sensitive data had nearly been stolen. Her security had failed catastrophically. A mysterious former soldier had appeared at the exact moment of the attack and remained unexplained. The share price, he noted with grave concern, could not be expected to withstand such turmoil. Each point was true or true enough, and together they built a case that seemed to leave the board no choice. Then Lucian delivered the proposal he had come to make. In the interest of stability, he suggested, Claire should step aside temporarily and hand the operational running of the company to a steady, experienced hand, to her own chief operating officer, Blaine Carrington. It was elegant. If the board agreed, Blaine would take control of the very data vault that Ashcroft had been trying to reach from the beginning, and he would take it not by force but by the vote of the people sworn to protect the company. Claire sat at the head of the table and felt the walls of it closing in, every argument reasonable, every face uncertain, the whole room tilting toward the quiet man who had engineered its fear. Nolan was not in that room. He had no standing there, no title, no reason to be present, and so he sat instead in a control room down the hall with Grant, watching and listening, and Claire, cornered and calm, played the card they had built together. She let slip, as though it were a small operational update, a single piece of information. The security device, she told the board, the one the attackers had tried so hard to seize, had been recovered. It had been found in the east stairwell shortly after the attack, dropped in the confusion. It was a lie. The device had never been in the east stairwell, but that detail existed nowhere in the world except in the words she had just spoken in that sealed room. A few minutes later, a message left a second phone belonging to Blaine Carrington, and Grant, following an internal investigation process that the company's lawyers had already approved, watched it go. Blaine had written to Tristan Wycliffe. They found it in the east stairwell. It was the bait swallowed whole, but it was not yet the hook. The hook was in the reply. Wycliffe answered, and in his answer he mentioned Service Elevator B. That detail had never been spoken aloud, never appeared in any report, never been shared with the board or the police or anyone outside a very small circle. Nolan recognized it instantly. Service Elevator B was the route the attackers had planned to use to carry Claire out of the hotel. Only the people who had built the plan could possibly know it, and Wycliffe had just named it in writing. Grant handed everything to the investigators already working the case, and moments later Blaine Carrington was called out of the boardroom, his face gray, his careful poise cracking as he stood. Lucian, remarkably, did not flinch. He said with the mild puzzlement of an innocent man that he had never heard of anyone called Wycliffe. Claire rose from her seat, walked the length of the table, and set a single folder down in front of him. Inside it was the consulting contract between Ashcroft Capital Partners and Wycliffe Security, his signature at the bottom of it. For the first time all morning, Lucian Ashcroft stopped smiling. It was then that Grant stepped into the boardroom, and Lucian, cornered but not yet beaten, looked past Claire to the weathered man standing quietly at the back and reached for the last weapon he had, which was contempt. "And this," he said, gesturing at Nolan with an elegant flick of his hand, "is your star witness?" "A maintenance man." Grant stopped in the doorway, and this was the moment the whole story had been walking toward from the very first shattered pane of glass. Grant did not raise his voice. He did not rise to the insult or hurry to defend his friend. He simply looked at Lucian Ashcroft across the long glass table and answered him with perfect, level calm. "No," he said. "I know exactly who he is." And then, before the whole board, Grant told them as much of the truth as he was permitted to tell. Nolan Vance had served in the Navy SEALs. Grant had watched with his own eyes this man bring people out of a situation that everyone else on the ground had already given up as lost. He said it plainly without embellishment, the testimony of one professional about another, and the room that had been tilting toward Ashcroft went very still. But Grant pressed on to the point that mattered more than any war story, and he made it slowly so that no one could miss it. Nolan Vance had not been hired by Claire Halston. He held no financial stake in the company, owned no shares, stood to gain nothing from any of it. He had no relationship with Halston Advanced Systems of any kind before the night of the gala. He had simply been a man in the wrong lobby at the right moment who saw a person in danger and chose to place his own body between her and harm, for no reason at all except that it was the thing he was made to do. And with that, the entire effort to paint Nolan as Ashcroft's secret accomplice collapsed, because a man with no motive and no connection is the hardest thing in the world to frame. Then it was Claire's turn, and she laid the chain of evidence on the table piece by piece, in the clear, ordered way she did everything. Nolan's access card, returned at 7:12 and used at 7:14, had been cloned. The administrator credential that cloned it belonged to Blaine Carrington's office. The leaked route had gone to that same office and drawn the watchers out. The payments had flowed from Ashcroft Capital to Wycliffe Security. The message naming Service Elevator B, a detail known only to the planners of the attack, had come back from Wycliffe's own phone, and the contract, signed in Lucian's own hand, tied the top of the chain to the bottom. There was no single dramatic arrest, no shouting, no struggle. The investigators simply asked Lucian, Blaine, and several others to remain and give statements, and within moments the lawyers began to gather around Ashcroft the way they always did, because his power had not vanished in an afternoon and would not. He would fight. He would delay. He would spend a fortune making the truth expensive to prove. But for the first time in the entire affair, Lucian Ashcroft was no longer the man who controlled the room, and everyone in it could feel the change. The board, its fear replaced by something colder and clearer, voted down the proposal to suspend Claire and voted instead to suspend Blaine Carrington pending the investigation. On their way out of the building, Claire walked beside Grant and asked the question that had been in her mind since the service corridor. "You recognized him that fast?" Grant looked ahead at Nolan, who walked a little apart from them as he always did, and he answered without hesitation. "There are some people," he said. "You only have to see Act once and you remember them for the rest of your life." Nolan, overhearing, was plainly uncomfortable with the weight of it. "You're laying it on a little thick," he muttered. Grant laughed, a real laugh, the first easy sound any of them had made in days. "You still hate being complimented," he said. "At least that hasn't changed." In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived the way real consequences do, unevenly, and without perfect justice. Blaine Carrington was charged in connection with supplying information and aiding the plan to seize Claire. His old family name no shield against the record of his own account and his own phone. Tristan Wycliffe became the subject of a widening investigation that reached into every contract his firm had ever signed. And Lucian Ashcroft did not lose everything in a single dramatic fall, because men like Lucian rarely do. But his acquisition of Halston Advanced Systems collapsed entirely. He was forced to step away from anything connected to the company, and the financial dealings of Ashcroft Capital Partners were open to an investigation that would follow him for years. Claire remained chief executive. She rebuilt her company's internal security from the ground up, and she kept Grant Holloway as her security chief because the failure at the gala had never been a failure of his skill. It had been the work of a traitor operating from inside the walls, and Grant had been the one to help pull that traitor into the light. Then Claire offered Nolan a position, a very senior one, at the head of her protective operations, and Nolan, to her surprise, refused it. She thought at first that he simply did not want to work with her, but that was not it at all, he explained. Personal protection work meant calls in the middle of the night, sudden travel to wherever the principal went, a life that would once again place the job ahead of the family, and he had already made that trade once and undone it at great cost. He would not undo it again. Claire listened and understood, and then she offered him something else instead. Director of Corporate Resilience and Emergency Planning. He would design the systems that kept people safe, the plans and the defenses and the responses, rather than standing personally in the line of fire. It was steady work. It was important work, and most of all, it was work that let Nolan Vance go home to June. He said yes. There was no kiss to end it, no sudden romance rushed into being, only a small moment at the close of his first ordinary day. Claire found him gathering his things at 5 o'clock, and she looked at him with something like wonder. "You really do leave on time," she said. Nolan pulled on his jacket. "I told you that from the start." His phone rang, June waiting for her father, and he stepped into the elevator. Grant came to stand beside Claire as the doors began to close, and she said, almost to herself, "The first time I met him, I thought he was just the man who checked the exits." Grant smiled. "Maybe that's why he's so good at it." She looked at him, and Grant finished the thought as the doors slid shut. Nolan Vance always knows where the way out is. If you enjoy secret-laden twists like this one, tap subscribe to the channel and follow along as Nolan Vance is forced to face his own past.